Hello and welcome to Intrigue Explained. My name is Dimitri and with me is John, as always. You haven't left yet.
I haven't left yet. I have been sick, so maybe that's a sign, but I'm still here.
I'm hoping that just the anticipation of doing this show every week hasn't gradually eked away at your health until you
Yeah,
are.
it destroyed my immune system.
Yeah,
Exactly. No, quite the opposite. I think it's given me a shot of adrenaline this morning to wake up and feel a bit better.
amazing, because I am expecting you to do all of the work on the trade topic while I critique your responses in real time.
More like professor-student situation.
So, for those of you who are joining us perhaps for the first time, this is a show called Intrigue Explained. It is a partnership between Explain Trade, that I work for, and International Intrigue, a company that John and his co founder started to explain the world of international relations in a quick and accessible way. John, is international relations easy to explain in a quick and accessible way?
Pretty much. I think you just make broad generalizations and move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as you just kind of throw random stuff at the wall based on what you reckon, it can't be that hard.
Exactly. I think if you look at Twitter, you'll get some nice critiques about how we're always stuffing it up, and it's actually very simple.
Actually, spelled with a K,
Exactly.
the true reply guy way. So, if you missed our last episode, we really dug into John's knowledge as a former Australian diplomat in China about what the COVID protests might mean for that country's leadership, where they come from, the background. We really started at sort of COVID patient zero and finished with last week, which was really fun for me because I basically just got to ask John questions for 45 solid minutes and doing no work whatsoever. This week, the show is going to be slightly on the other foot as we dig into whether the US and EU are headed for a dreaded trade war. Uh, about, I think about a few years ago in the Brexit context, the press discovered the term trade war and have now just been slapping it on everything, which is driving
Mm.
trade experts nuts. I'm sure IR experts have the same problem with about 55 different terms.
Exactly. You've just taken a question I wanted to ask you about why this idea just it's becoming the new sort of gate for everything. It's like every disagreement about exchanging goods has become a trade war.
And we could absolutely dig into why that's perhaps a broader use of that term that is legitimate. But
Mm.
before that, as always, something we do on this show pretty religiously, even in special episodes, is we take five of the stories that jumped out at John and his team, as well as me, from the International Intrigue daily newsletter, which is kind of like a 5-6 minute hit of IR from all over the world. And we pick out five of those stories to basically highlight for you, to give you our hot takes on for what little they are worth, and really to just put them on your radar in case they weren't. So every week, John and his team sort through those, and with your indulgence, we'd love to throw some of those at you now. Beginning
Yeah,
with,
absolutely. Oh,
Mhm.
yeah. So I was going to
No,
say this week I think we've tried to surface some stories that ran that line between mainstream news and perhaps maybe not have been discovered around the world. And the first one of those, which I know did make the front page of the BBC, but it was the Indonesian pre-marital or outside of marital sex ban that was passed earlier this week. So the story here is that Indonesia's parliament unanimously passed a law that will take effect within 3 years, banning premarital or extramarital sex and threatening people with a prison stint. So the idea here is, I think Indonesia's had it's been illegal to have extramarital sex for a while in Indonesia, but the charges must be brought by someone who has, I guess, what you would call standing. So, close relatives, a spouse, parent, or child. And that's the same with this law. So, no, I think something that got missed in the media here was everyone was like, oh my God, my holiday to Bali is going to be ruined. Now, that still may be the case. But one thing that I think was missed in this news is that these charges must be brought or initiated by close relatives or a spouse or something like that. They face, if you cohabit outside of marriage, you face 6 months in prison. And as part of the law as well that got passed, a sitting president, offending a sitting president will also be a crime, which obviously none of these things are great for the idea of freedom and living your life as you wish.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think my reaction initially when this kind of news broke, there was a lot of kind of concentrated giggling online until people really started digging into the implications. My first reaction was, boy, this would not have affected me in my 20s.
I was going to
Uh,
say, I had the same thought.
uh, but
At least you have an excuse.
yes,
I
and
would
it
have,
wasn't that
but
I was married. But on a really serious note, the way that the law is designed has raised a lot of alarm bells for LGBTQ
mm,
people, because it is seen as a potential way of effectively repressing that community by more conservative members of their family. So this kind of notion that this could be weaponized specifically against minority communities in order to police sort of morality norms
mm,
is quite a serious side of this. The freedom of speech element of it, so this idea that it is now punishable by, I believe, up to 3 years in prison to insult the sitting president. Um, that was slightly watered down from its initial drafting in the sense that the
yeah,
president has to bring the charges themselves. This is not. It is not simply a matter of the police being able to grab up anyone who is criticizing the president, but the president has to sort of personally advance charges against against the perpetrator. Now you can sort of certainly question whether that makes it significantly better, but it is certainly a step in that direction. Um,
yeah, it probably moves it from a more broad freedom of speech kind of law towards a political freedom kind of law. I mean, if the president has to bring it himself, you can see it being used against candidates he doesn't like, or he or she doesn't like, or opponents, rather than, as you say, going into the homes of people in Jakarta and saying, "Hey, don't insult me." But I mean, either way, it's pretty troubling, and it was passed unanimously. So I think to the extent that the Indonesian lawmakers are the representative will of Indonesia, it's fairly overwhelming.
Yeah. Just to push back on that a little bit, I guess the flip side of
Mm.
it politically is now the president doesn't have a degree of separation in situations like this, where the president has to be very visible. If the president wants to charge an opponent, they have to personally charge an opponent.
They
It
have to
is
attach
they
themselves to it.
can't
That's a good
they
point.
can't simply go take a step back and go, well, it's unfortunate what's happening to this person, but the
That's a good point.
judiciary has to enforce the law. And if I had my way, of course, I'm not offended, but the law is
Mhm.
the law, and they brought charges. The prosecutor's independent, the judges are independent. It's not on me. So I think there's goods and bads to the way that this has been done. But as you say, it is troubling.
Yep, agree.
Our next story: the Peru almost coup. I was
Yeah.
more
Well, so
proud
this
of
is
that than I should have been.
Peru almost.
Yeah.
Now you have to say it out loud to realize it. I read it and was like, that seems fair. Well, okay, the Peru almost coup, just to make Dimitri happy there. So this was the story that 2 days ago. Is that right? Yes, two days ago, Wednesday afternoon.
Time flies.
Um, it does, doesn't it? I know. I feel like it's been a whirlwind. A news started emerging out of Peru that Pedro Castillo, their embattled president, he's been sort of in and out of global news headlines for a while now. That he announced that he was going to disband the constitution or disband the Congress and rule by decree for a period of time to protect democracy. Blink twice if you've heard that before. But so he faced an impeachment vote that afternoon by Congress and was impeached on corruption. Officials resigned en masse, and they appointed the deputy president or the vice president, Dina Boluarte, who happens to be now Peru's first woman president. Um, But it was a day of, I think, nervous watching Peruvian politics. They've been pretty chaotic for a while. Then you have this fairly renegade president try and seize power, or at least prevent being removed from power. And the real worry there is that violence is going to kick off, and it's going to descend into a real, catastrophic political, perhaps civil situation. So far, and touching all the wood that we can, it looks like the political stability has been sort of returned. It looked like he was actually pretty unpopular rather than just unpopular with 51% of the population. And we haven't really seen much more news out of Peru since then. I will say the US very quickly referred to him as the former president, and Mexico and Chile came out and sort of announced pretty quickly that they were watching and they regret the situation, but they called for calm. Now, obviously, they do that all the time, and statements aren't often worth the paper they're written on, but I do think it kind of helps say that, make it very clear that what we care about most is that whatever happens, it doesn't descend any further than this.
Yeah, I think it's the history of this here. I'm certainly not an expert on Latin America, but there was a lot of hope in Castillo when he came in. He was, I think, the first left-wing president Peru had had for some time, and he ran on a reform and anti-corruption platform in addition to some of these kind of left-wing ideas, but basically very quickly got bogged down in scandals within his own government, in corruption allegations, and basically, I don't think necessarily lived up to the hope of a lot of people. With that said, the new president, Dina Boluarte, is also a socialist. So it's not sort of a return to right-wing governments yet. And I suppose in a positive sign, because we now have to get excited anytime institutions seem to work. He attempted what was effectively a coup d'etat. There's no way to describe disbanding Congress right before it impeaches you on corruption charges as anything else. But officials resigned. The courts ruled that what he was doing was unconstitutional, and the army and police basically came out and said, "We will not use force to keep you in power. We will not support you remaining in power, contrary to the decree of the judiciary and sort of the will of Congress." So far it's been bloodless on all sides, fingers crossed. So sort of the fail-safes on democracy worked in Peru in this case.
As we say, good news.
Yeah, as of the 9th of December at 4:14 p.m. CET, there is potentially sort of good news about the strength of institutions in Peru, which is, I think, should be celebrated.
Agreed. Completely agreed. Okay, let's move on to the third story. And this was widely reported, at least here in the US. And it was the prisoner swap for Brittany Griner for Victor Bout. So, step back a second. Brittany Griner is a WNBA superstar, really a superstar, one of the best players to have ever played the game. And she was arrested in Moscow right before the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February the 17th for having a small amount of hash oil in her carry-on luggage or in her luggage in Moscow. She was sentenced to a 9-year jail term in August, and then she was recently moved to a penal colony, one of the famous Russian penal colonies in somewhere remote near Moscow. So that's one. That was the American who was imprisoned in Russia. Victor Bout, on the other hand, was I don't know how to say his name actually. It's probably like Bout or something, but he's a Russian national who was the subject of the Lord of War movie in 2005. He was an international weapons runner. He was convicted in Thailand, or caught in Thailand and convicted of trying to acquire an anti-air missile to give to terrorists. He's a real bad dude.
He among us who hasn't, cast the first
tried to buy a cheeky missile, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Was it in a stinger operation, John? Was he caught in a stinger operation?
I was trying to set that up for you.
Yeah.
you smashed it. That's good.
Yes.
So anyway, they were exchanged for each other. So Russia released Griner and the US released Victor Bout, and they I sort of knew this stuff happened, but I didn't realize it actually still happened like this. In that two private planes flew, landed in the UAE, landed on the same tarmac. They got out, crossed each other on the tarmac, like face to face almost. Got on their other planes and flew to their respective countries. So yeah, it's big news. Obviously, Biden celebrated it, and then there's still the big controversy, I guess, was that there's still a U.S. Marine in Russian custody, charged with spying. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know you have some strong feelings about, I suppose, the Russian reaction to how this went and to Victor Bout's liberation. I will say a couple of things to kind of throw in here from my side. I think, firstly, it is proof again that negotiations are happening. There's this consistent narrative in the media that the US is just refusing to talk to Russia, and that's why there aren't peace talks in Ukraine. This again proves that that's not true. That the sides in this conflict are talking to one another, and they're discussing areas where convergence is theoretically possible. What they're not doing is discussing sort of how much Ukrainian territory Ukraine is willing to hand over to Russia, and they're not talking about ceasefires because of Putin's preconditions that discussion requires a formal acceptance of the annexation of those four provinces as parts of Russia. So it kind of, these conversations are happening, and that is good. Any way you slice it, more diplomacy is good, even if it's not going to resolve the underlying thing. Secondly, I think a lot of the pushback has talked about precedent and what message does this send? And my hot take is this isn't a hypothetical. This isn't an exercise we're doing in a classroom. There was an American woman, a woman of color, who is also a lesbian in a Russian penal colony. That is what she must have been going through. The Russian penal system is horrific in ways people can't even imagine, and she would have been getting the extra special horror treatment. The Biden administration got her out, and I think questions about precedent, whether we're encouraging hostage taking, all very good in the abstract, but my personal take is governments have a duty to their citizens, and it's great she's home.
So we might have our first genuine disagreement on our show. I obviously, I don't disagree with those facts that you said. It's great that she's home, and it was horrific that she was arrested. And I think even Blind Freddy would understand that those crimes are not, by any cultural standard, morally equivalent.
No.
Where I would push back is that I think so. Intrigue ran I think if we can toot our own horn, a really interesting piece on why democracies pay a higher price for prisoner swaps than autocracies. And one of the reasons is exactly that attitude that you put forward, which is it doesn't matter how we do it. We've got to get these people out because they're our citizens. We have a duty to our citizens. Now, I think that's true, but we know in the cold, hard light of day, that these kind of regimes, Russia, China, Iran, and plenty others beside, hostage diplomacy is part of their foreign policy. An unspoken part of their foreign policy, but it is. China engaged in it when Canada followed international law by honoring an extradition warrant from the US a few years ago. Iran does it on the reg. And in my view, what you do when you engage in these swaps, or at least in these swaps that are so manifestly uneven in terms of the kinds of criminals that are getting released, is that you incentivize the worst people in the world who are useful to regimes to be released if you just pick up someone traveling through an airport. The US can spend tens of millions of dollars bringing one of the world's worst war criminals to justice. But if you catch someone with a bit of pot, or at least a bit of harsh oil, you can get them back. So I actually think I do think precedent matters. I take your point that it's not a classroom and it's not theoretical, but I do think it sets a dangerous precedent for people, for just knowing that you can get back the worst criminals. There's no point in arresting the worst ones, because we'll just arrest 4 of yours and then we'll have a big diplomatic spat. But that said, if I was in any way related, I can say this with the privilege of not being related to Brittany Griner, and what she went through is horrific, and I would be thrilled that she's back. But yeah, I guess my take is just that it does set a bad precedent, and it's not a good idea.
I mean, I guess where I would push back is I accept that there are limits to what we should offer in exchange to get a citizen home. You know, if they had said we will keep Brittany Griner unless the US ends all aid to Ukraine or delivers us 15 HIMARS of our own, complete with operators because our guys can't read instructions. Yes, obviously there should be limits to what we offer in order to exchange this. But thinking on it, I mean, in this specific case, this guy has been arrested in 2008. He has been in prison in a US prison for 10 years. He is unlikely to ever be effective again as a weapons smuggler. It is fairly safe to say that sort of his face is pretty well known to Interpol and most customs authorities. He does not represent an active danger to the US or its interests. Is it necessarily is it justice that he gets to be released early rather than at the culmination of his term? No. Is this potentially setting a precedent, as you say, to get Russia and others to look for more opportunities to effectively extort for prisoner exchanges? Yes, that's all there. But a one-for-one exchange at the end of the day, I think, is a relatively... There are very few criminals who I think are so dangerous and so detrimental to, for example, US interests that a swap wouldn't make sense. I would also add, listen, if you're a US citizen, if you could just going forward not travel to Russia, that would be great. You know, she was there beforehand doing something perfectly legitimate. It's very normal for pro athletes.
She did break the law. She broke the law there. And she broke
I mean,
the law
allegedly
in America too. Well, allegedly, she did admit to it, but yeah, whatever. Yeah, I agree.
So we should both smoke some of what she was carrying and chill out. But I think it's one of those places where we'll have to kind of agree to disagree. As long as we broadly agree I'm right.
I don't agree to that.
Damn it!
All right.
All right.
We'll move on to our fourth story, which is this interesting idea that Qatar's World Cup hosting, or perhaps World Cup hosting, might be bringing them back into the fold with their neighbours. This comes off the news that the UAE president, Sheikh Mohammed, visited Qatar on Monday for the first time since the region, Saudi and the UAE boycotted Qatar a few years ago, back I think starting in 2017. So we, I guess, have this narrative that the World Cup was sports washing and it didn't work because the West was kind of criticizing it. But here we have a regional competitor visiting Qatar for the first time in a while. Now, the background here, and maybe you can expand on it a little bit, is that in 2017, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Yemen, Egypt, Bahrain, all announced severing ties with Qatar. And that lasted for about, I think, 3 or 4 years until 2021, when they ended the sort of blockade / freeze of Qatar. But it's been slowly thawing since then. But this is still the first visit of a head of state of one of those countries to Qatar. So it's worth noting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an immensely complicated story. As stories in the Middle East, nothing in the Middle East is ever just like, well, the A happened because of B. There was a huge amount of tension in the region, basically, that came down that I think really initiated with the Arab Spring and the fact that Qatar found itself on opposite sides of the Arab Spring in terms of who they voiced support for to a lot of their neighbors. This comes down to Qatar is considered to have strong ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is kind of opposed by some of its neighbors. Qatar cooperates more with Iran, which is the regional boogeyman in a lot of ways. They have military cooperation with Turkey, which again has some tension in the region. So there was of course Al Jazeera, which is really in some ways the CNN of the region and was considered hugely influential, has an editorial line that is considered inseparable from the preferences of the Qatari government, and was seen to be sort of saying things that went against the grain of Gulf Cooperation Council regional politics. The thawing now, I mean, it's and that led to sort of severing of diplomatic relations, recalling of ambassadors, denying
Yeah, it was a big
Qatari,
deal.
denying Qatari registered planes and ships from using regional airspace and sea routes, which is a pretty big deal, especially when Saudi Arabia closed the only land crossing into Qatar. So it was almost a
It was an
blockade.
effort to really like isolate them. Yeah, blockade, exactly. Yeah, so it's a big
Absolutely.
deal that the guy visited.
Yeah, and the GC, it has to be said, the GCC issued a range of demands way back then, to sort of as conditions to lift this blockade. Things like severing military cooperation with Turkey, ending cooperation with Iran, aligning its politics with its neighbors and its international relations with its neighbors. And it seems like Qatar did basically none of that. As far as we can tell, up until now, Qatar really didn't do much of that, and Qatar was able to weather the economic storm. So it's not clear whether this kind of détente stuff is happening because its neighbors have given up on the tools they had in their toolbox, whether, as you say, the World Cup has succeeded in bringing everyone together, just like Infantino, the self-described gay, disabled
Qatari.
Arab Qatari migrant worker, who also happens to be the president of FIFA, wanted. Or perhaps there's this sort of sense that things have moved on. There's also a take on this, which might be a bit US centric, that Saudi Arabia and others wanted to demonstrate to the Biden administration that they can play ball in the region, that they are capable of constructive engagement and working together on bigger issues. So there's a lot going on here, but we can't rule out that the World Cup may have done what it was supposed to do and brought Qatar closer to its neighbors.
Well, I mean, that's certainly what FIFA will be saying anyway.
A steal
Um,
at 200 billion.
yeah, and 7,000 deaths or whatever it is. Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. All right. Well, on that note, we've been sort of taking feedback and trying not to end each of these little wrap ups on that's bad news and the world's going to hell. We're
Yep.
so sorry to finish that way. So here's one that I mean has an element of that for sure, but at least has a patina of absurdity that allows us to kind of feel like it's not as grim as others. And it's obviously the story that uh, a very minor piece royalty. I was going to say piece of royalty, and I think that's actually appropriate. A royal in Germany, along with a bunch of other clearly lunatic people, tried to take over the German government. So the actual story is that German police rounded up dozens of these conspirators, which include the self-styled prince that I alluded to, a retired paratrooper, a former judge, and accused them of discussing to violently overthrow the government. This happened on Wednesday. I don't think I have seen anything which described how concrete those plans were. But I think for the special police to run an operation, which I gather was in a bunch of different cities and all executed at the same time, a major coordination operation. They were obviously concerned that something was coming to a head and wanted to nip it in the bud. And as you said, if these clowns had their way, a new Kaiser Wilhelm Germany, which I know doesn't bear reading when you read a tweet, but I had to mention that gag because I
It's,
cried laughing.
it's, I'm glad someone did. Really, audience of one. Yeah, this story is like, it was when it broke. The global reaction was, what?
Is
And
this the onion?
really, like, you don't necessarily expect to hear about coups thwarted in Western Europe in the 21st century. And as you alluded to, I think there is a lot of questions about how close the Reichsbürger movement was to actually overthrowing the German the German government and the German state and installing a German aristocracy atop a restored Reich. In fact, I think we can pretty convincingly say it wasn't going to happen. Just as I think in the US, I don't think the January 6th protesters were likely to actually overthrow the US government, but they still could have done a potentially tremendous amount of damage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the idea that, yeah, I mean, one of the things that stands out to me about this is just that they have no one in their ranks that goes, guys, I don't know that this is going to be successful. It's the depth of the conspiracy holes that folks get into these days is really quite alarming. And I think I think it's sort of, I mean, in one sense, you'd come back with me with that statement by just saying, well, the January 6th plotters really did cause a lot of harm, and
Mm.
they were just as fringe and just as lunatic here in the US. But I think what it does show is this Reichsbürger movement has apparently got links to QAnon, according to several reports, and it just shows that modern communications technology allows these very virulent conspiracy frameworks. I don't want to call them necessarily theories because they're almost like these frameworks that allow lots, like, plug and play your own little
Hmm.
theory as it suits you wherever you are. And if QAnon's that framework, then these German folks sort of like, oh yes, well that means that we can restore the Second Reich, and in the US it means something else. So I think it's an interesting note to see how the globalization of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I think what I mean, definitely agree with you there. I think it's interesting. You sort of say, did nobody say, hey, we couldn't do this? And I
Mm,
think it's always difficult with these movements to tell to what extent was this just consistent cosplay, where they
right.
realized it wasn't going to happen. They weren't ever going to get to the point where sort of as a mass movement they try to seize power. I think the
Mm,
comparison with the January 6th guys is that just kind of it was pre-planned to some extent, but it also just kind of snowballed to the point
mm,
where a lot of the interviews with them, they sort of found themselves inside their Capitol building and just kind
mm,
of went, wait a second, like we didn't think we'd get here, but now that we're here, like let's continue doing this. So we don't know to what extent they thought they had a serious chance at doing this. They were, of course, arrested before they could actually launch a coup against Schultz and the government. The movement itself is just the more you read about it, it's bizarre. It's a
totally.
I mean they believe that Germany is not a legitimate state and hasn't been since the dissolution of the Reich. They believe it is a private corporation. uh, they are all of these aristocrats joined it because they were Eastern European German royalty who thought they were going to get the properties that had gotten nationalized off them by the communists back after reunification, which Germany obviously didn't do. So they're angry about that. But the one thing I'd kind of finish on is, yes, this is weird, and yes, this is fun to laugh about. But, and I'm far from the first person to say this, people were like, oh, this movement included, guys from the special forces and it had strong
Mm,
military links. And I was sort of sitting there going, well, yeah. I mean, the joining the military is inherently somewhat of a nationalist thing to do. You are being asked to put your life on the line for your country. That has obvious parallels to that. That doesn't make everybody in the military a nationalist, but the idea that we're going to have militaries without a subsect of nationalists is insane. Fascism is all about dressing up in the stylings of the military. It's about wrapping yourself in the armed forces. It's about centering the entire state on the armed forces. That is going to have an appeal to people who are in the armed forces.
to a small subset
Oh
of the
yeah, of
people, isn't it?
course.
Yeah.
Yeah, like just inevitably, there is, and I think we as a society have sometimes, like in the US and in other places, have shied away from putting that under the microscope the way we should, out of a completely understandable and I think justifiable respect for people's service. This
Yeah,
sense,
I mean, I agree with you entirely, and I think I would say, yeah, you made the point right. It's a small subset of folks. It shouldn't be surprising because any large organization where you are trained to have lethal power and how to use it is going to have some nut jobs. And in a way, it's remarkable that there aren't more, if in my opinion. But
yeah, or at least that we don't hear about them. And I think this we have to get over the cultural kind of not cringe
It's
But
not a
the
taboo
cultural
question.
aversion not to look at this critically and say it doesn't reflect a broader criticism. We're not saying everybody in the army is fascist or 10 minutes away from being a fascist. And we're not saying anything like that. We're not saying joining the army is a fascist act. Of course it's not. But I do think we have to say that we have to look at it really, really critically and make sure that the armed forces themselves continue to self-police and not to allow this kind of the shared brotherhood that they understandably share with their fellow servicemen to prevent them from identifying really dangerous people who have really dangerous skills and who may sympathize with some of these really dangerous ideas.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, we've restored agreement after our fight over prisoners.
We're
I
gonna
don't
have
know
to do
who.
better than that. It was a fairly fizzly fight. We're gonna have to
Yeah,
introduce some more jeopardy.
you should have. I think in order to have the proper banter, you should have just been like, no, she deserves to stay there. That would have been a fight. Like,
drugs are bad, okay?
yeah, send all drug offenders to a Russian penal colony, says John Fowler, and then we could have had a good fiery discussion before moving on to German weirdos. I'm definitely cutting that clip out of context, by the way. Just if you're wondering why you're the main, if you're wondering why you're the main character of Twitter tomorrow, then that's what's going on.
Yeah.
Great. All right.
Appreciate it. Thanks, bud.
You're welcome, buddy. That brings us back. That brings us to like the main story that we wanted to get into a bit this week, which is US and EU tensions and whether there is going to be a trade war between the US and EU over the Inflation Reduction Act. So, let me maybe start by just giving you boring, wonky context, and then John, you can ask me whatever it is I've left out, or just yell at me. So, the Trump era did not represent a hugely harmonious time in US and EU relations, including on trade. Trump famously thought that we were being ripped off, that the US was being ripped off by everybody, and sort of moved quite aggressively to try to prop up US firms at the expense of everybody. That was Trump's vision. When the Biden administration came in, there was a lot of hope that a new leaf would be turned and that relations would get back into cordiality. However, the Biden administration recently passed its really signature big economic package, which was the Inflation Reduction Act, House Resolution 52 something something. And that includes just obscene amounts of spending on all sorts of things, as these big pieces of US legislation tend to.
Always do, yeah.
Including subsidies for basically climate-related activities. So specifically, subsidies for the purchase of electric vehicles, and solar panels and a few other things. So basically really positive climate-friendly investments to throw a ton of government money to expand the take-up of goods considered environmentally friendly and sort of positive for addressing climate change. The challenge is the way the IRA is written, those subsidies are in a lot of cases conditional on the goods they're paying for having either a huge proportion of US components, like a battery made in the US for electric vehicles, or having it had been assembled in the US. That represents a massive threat to EU firms because it basically creates a significant price differential. Because if you try to buy a EU-made electric vehicle, you won't get access to this subsidy and this tax credit. So why would you? You may as well buy the US one. It's a absolutely blatant violation of WTO rules. In a way, a lot more blatant than anything Trump did, because under Trump, they tried to wrap it in a patina of national security, and they tried to sort of sidestep the rule, and they tried to wrap it in a fig leaf of WTO compliance. Whereas with the IRA, they knew exactly what they were doing, and by all accounts, they just went. Either Congress didn't care at all, or they didn't think about it. But the kind of subsidies that they are proposing are pretty uncontroversially WTO inconsistent. There's kind of, I don't think there's a huge amount of debate about that. And the EU has blown its stack about it. It's the EU has gotten very, very upset. The EU has started openly talking about developing its own subsidy regime, also conditional on like make in EU requirements. So basically doing the same thing in the EU as the US is doing in the US, in order to kind of start this subsidy for subsidy thing, and in order to rebalance things. As well as whenever these things start happening, everybody starts talking about tariffs on one another, and how do you sort of punish the other side for trade chicanery. Last thing I'll say before I turn it over to you.
I'm enraptured. This is interesting.
That's the only person who's enraptured with trade content, John. The only one. There are conversations have been ongoing. The Trade and Technology Council, which is this high-level bilateral forum that the US and EU created when Biden came in, created a special subcommittee or committee that specifically designed to address the concerns the EU have. The US does have the ability and has kind of hinted that it can use implementation, the way that it actually implements the IRA, to let some EU firms into the tent, to make some EU production eligible for the IRA subsidies, to basically lessen the impact. And everyone keeps meeting and sort of trying to send positive signals. I should say, just to provide some context, a trade war is when two sides basically start deliberately hammering one another with trade measures in order to cause one another pain. I don't think anyone thinks this is what's happening here or where this is headed. The analysis is the US either didn't care what this would do to Europe, or needed these local content requirements in order to get the bill passed domestically, and in order for the Democrats to do well in the midterms. Basically, the ability for Democrats to go back to their constituencies and say, we passed the IRA, which is going to build good green jobs right here in Georgia, was so important that they overlooked this other stuff. It wasn't about throwing an elbow at Europe. It was an elbow that got thrown as part of other things. And so...
Okay. So let me just put a pin in that. I think that's interesting because my first question to you was going to be, let's talk about this trade war framing, because having a newsletter, I'm always interested in how whether the media is covering this sensationally or whether it is a trade war. And you've said there that a trade war is when two countries are just basically at war but using economic measures to fire shots, or roughly that. So what do you think? Why do you think we're using trade war so much since maybe Trump and China? Well, what is it about that phrase? Is it just that it's really hard to make trade stuff get clicks, and this is how you do it, or what?
I've always wondered how you make trade stuff get clicks. Haven't quite figured it out. Yeah. So I think firstly it's evocative, right? Like everybody loves military terms for everything, because it's just sort of instinctively, sport. So there's that component of it. I would also say that the US-China thing was a little bit closer to a trade war, and there is no formal agreed definition. Let me also add that. So it's not like there's like a this isn't like measuring gravity or whatever. There's people can call it different things. So I think there's a tendency to reach for that term because it's sexy and because you're not provably wrong. My only thing is that kind of, if this is a trade war, we've been at various trade wars pretty much non-stop forever.
Well, it's like a trade disagreement, right? Like a disagreement over elements of domestic policy vis-a-vis how it affects our trade.
Yeah, and historically, I should say that sort of, especially in the last couple of decades, governments have generally been pretty good at ring fencing strong disagreements they
Yes,
have about trade from like everything else. You were
yes,
allowed to be like furiously suing each other back and forth in the WTO while still best friends. Like Australia sued Canada at the
right.
WTO in like the world's politest, nicest dispute where we sort of like we're coming to get
Sorry,
you,
no,
but
we're sorry.
yeah, that sounds like literally that. Like, does this hearing date work for you? I'm so sorry if it doesn't. We'll change it. We'll change it. So
Right.
so that kind of ring fencing has been able to go on for a while, and so I think it is useful to keep our powder dry when we're talking about trade wars until you see like Europe looking at vulnerable districts in the
Yeah,
US and
yeah.
specifically excluding their exports in order to kind of
Well,
stick the
to
knife
your
in.
to your point that China one was closer to a trade war. I mean, I remember there was a period of time where um, the Chinese were attacking vulnerable Iowan districts for soybeans, right? Because
Yeah.
they knew that would be disproportionately politically
Yeah.
relevant to people in Washington. So that's kind of what you're talking about, rather than sort of saying this is a policy that disproportionately benefits our country, but isn't necessarily trying to hurt yours specifically because we want to change your political thinking.
Exactly. And I think there's a meta thing going on here, which is to do with where governments are at on climate change at the moment, especially in the West. We've gotten to this point where governments on the whole in the West have now admitted that climate change is a problem. It's a man made problem, and it's a problem we need to do something about by going green. But at the moment, the only way they seem to be able to sell it domestically is as a net positive that will create green jobs and especially traditional green manufacturing jobs, as sort of, we need to put solar panels everywhere and we're going to build them.
Yeah,
uh, and that's where a lot of this comes from, because that's how Europe's sort of begun thinking about it. That's
right.
how India thinks about solar panels. That's how a lot of countries are thinking about it, saying like these are the factory jobs of the future. Everyone in trade always competes for factory jobs for all sorts of reasons. So how can we use trade policy to make sure that we are the leaders in green tech and in exporting green tech? So that's kind of what we're seeing playing out here a little bit, and that's better than nothing. And I think Sam Lowe made this point in his newsletter, which is Most Favored Nation, which is very good, which basically said, listen, this IRA is probably protectionist. I mean, it is protectionist, but is that better than no IRA at all? And probably not. So this is, yeah, that's kind of where we're at
So
with the
that's
climate
exactly what
agenda.
I wanted to drill down on. Firstly, you mentioned that it's protectionist. So to someone who knows very little about trade, what is different about this protectionist measure? And I want to get to why it's illegal at the WTO, or violating the WTO in a bit, because I don't understand that either. But why is that protectionism different to, say, European agricultural protectionism or Japanese rice protectionism? Or why is this protectionism seen to make everyone go, okay, this time it's different? Because I mean, you don't hear the Europeans and people bitching and moaning about the European protectionism. Well, you do, but not as
Have
mainstream
you
as
ever read an
this.
Australian press release?
Right, exactly. But you get my point. Not that
Yeah.
doesn't blow up across the world.
So one issue is new policy versus legacy policy.
Some people
European
use the
agricultural
old one.
protectionism is older than time.
Right.
There is this sense of it has very much been factored in. There are still, like, everybody still complains about it, but it is kind of the way of the world. And while it is kind of problematic, it is considered somewhat baked in, and in areas it's gotten better. The EU has liberalized its subsidy regime somewhat. It's allowed more market access. It's signed free trade agreements that give people access to its market and so on. Whereas this, we are talking about new and as yet undefined measures in what are effectively new industries, or new when you compare them to agriculture, which is 100,000 years old, or whenever it is we started planting things. So there's that aspect of it. The second part of it is that the costs in the money involved is very, very high. Um, so kind of the subsidies that the US provides that are considered like trade distorting are somewhere like the 20 billion. The IRA is factors larger. So we might be
Right.
talking about more money. Things get a bit murkier with Japan and EU, which spend quite a lot on agricultural support, but it's a different conversation. Um, and there is the sort of blatant disregard for WTO rules aspect of it, which is a problem because people see the US as having written these rules and being at least historically a champion of them, whereas this seems like an overt slap in the face to that rules-based system, and it begs the question of like, well, what's the next domino to fall? What is the previous thing that we had considered solved that will now get unpicked in service to domestic agendas?
Interesting. Okay, I want to talk about that WTO again in a bit. So, when your friend, your friend wrote his newsletter, Most Favored Nation, why is it not the case that maybe protectionism in the US to get a domestic industry starting and get to scale? You know, EVs, for all their pomp and circumstance, are still not at scale. Why is it not better to foster a domestic? You know, the US market is huge. Foster a domestic market, get the appetite, get demand, get the technology down to cost effective cost of goods sold, and then liberalize it in 10, 15 years time, or whatever it is. Why is that not? Why did he reject that kind of idea, or if he did reject it?
Well, so here's why kind of trade theory rejects it. Here's why that kind of thinking is problematic. We need
Mm-hmm.
to get as many electric vehicles on the road as we can as quickly as possible. We need to get as many photovoltaics on the roof as soon as we can. If you have $1 trillion and you want to support that goal, what you really want to be doing is supporting a global race to see who can develop the most efficient, cost efficient, sexiest products of this nature and can get them to consumers. So if you want to give anybody a tax credit for buying an electric vehicle, you want to say, we'll knock 5K off your taxes if you buy an EV, and you want to be supportive of climate change, what you should be doing is if you buy an EV that is an EV, we'll give you $5,000.
Yep.
By saying we'll only give it to you if you buy a US one, you are you are sort of by definition saying we support competition, but really only among US
Right.
producers. You create a pretty strong incentive for US producers to invest more in lobbying Congress to keep that protection than you do them in R&D, because you just massively lower the amount of competition they face. And so that is trade 101 theory, why it is a bad idea to do these kind of things. Now, the flip side of it, and I think Sam makes this point, and I think it's there in your question, is if this is the only way you get to spend $100 billion on giving
Right.
people subsidies to buy cars,
Yeah.
then that is better than maybe. I'm not an
Could be
economist,
better.
but it suggests it's probably better than doing nothing at all.
Right.
Um, so that's kind of is this the trade off? The challenge becomes, does this lead to a kind of subsidy and protectionism race among the
Yeah.
Europe and US, where everybody ends up sort of spending unsustainably in ways that price everybody else out of the market, and so on and so forth. So there is a challenge to this too, and there's a potential slippery slope to this, but that's kind of
No,
the two sides of the debate.
that makes a lot of sense to me. So we don't have much time left. So I
Mhm.
do want to ask you, explain to me in the quickest way possible. I know you could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. Why is it very clearly against the WTO rules?
Sure. So the WTO rules have a principle called national treatment, which basically, for goods, says that you are allowed to discriminate against foreign goods to some extent, but only at the border. Once a foreign product has entered your market, once you've let it in, you have to treat it the same way you do every other product. The reason governments agreed to this rule is so that other governments weren't sneaky and say, look, I've lowered my tariffs the way I promised to, and then use a bunch of regulations and subsequent checks to mess with product, to make product undesirable, even after they've crossed the border. So it is a violation to say that you are going to basically have somebody at a dealership look at a row of cars and say the government's going to give you a subsidy for that vehicle, that electronic vehicle, but not for that functionally identical electronic vehicle, because that one was assembled in Germany.
Elsewhere.
But the first one was assembled in Detroit. So that's kind of rule one. The other rule that this is pretty blatantly in violation of is a type of subsidy you are explicitly forbidden from making is based on local content requirements. You are not supposed to subsidize things on the basis of where the bits that go into them are made. That is kind of the other rule that this is blatantly in violation of. And in both cases, the logic behind the rules are kind of the same. It is supposed to encourage global competition. And you're allowed to subsidize producers to an extent, but what you're not allowed to do is kind of condition those subsidies. You're allowed to subsidize your producers and not foreign producers. What you're not allowed to do is subsidize your producers on the basis of where their inputs come from.
It's like, it's both the clearest explanation I've ever heard of that, and also my mind is going like, but then what about this situation? I guess it's like the tax code, right? The longer this stuff goes and the more loopholes you put into it, and the more like concessions you carve out to get an overall deal, the more complex this stuff gets.
Yeah, I mean, trade law is not like divinely inspired scripture. It is negotiated stuff that reflects balances of power and trade-offs and like what people were thinking about in 94 or whatever. So there is, sometimes you do look at some of this stuff and you go, wait, why can I do this, but I cannot do this other thing that seems even like better? I've
got two more questions. The first one is, you alluded to it at the start, and it's that in many ways this is more protectionist than anything Donald Trump did. So what is it about? So in a way, this is a more America first kind of policy than a lot that happened under Trump. So what is it about? Why isn't that being said more? Why isn't there more criticism or support, depending on which way you slice the political conversation? Why isn't that being surfaced in this? And I don't want it to get into a domestic political conversation of who's right and wrong, but just that idea of why isn't that a key part of the coverage of this?
Well, I mean, as to who's right and who's wrong, I'm right and you're wrong. We established that at the Griner thing. But to answer your question, stick strictly on the trade and optics merits. The tools that Trump were using, which are tariffs, are much more in your face and measurable. So tariffs are always described as something you do to someone else. In practice, you're taxing your own consumers.
You slap them on.
Exactly. You slap on tariffs. You hit someone with tariffs. It feels like an aggressive thing because it's always framed as something you are doing to a specific competitor, right? Whereas the stuff in the IRA, firstly, it hasn't happened yet. It's going to get phased in over years, so there's that aspect of it. But also, like, it's much more, it's a tax credit for your consumers based on where what they buy comes from.
Snooze.
Exactly. It is just not as, like, you saw me, we've just been trying to explain it for like 20 minutes, and I don't know if anybody followed. Like, it's just much more complex. They're also just not being as big. Like, for Trump, the violence was the point. He woke up and chose violence every day of his life, pretty much, but especially on this issue, he was trying to pick a fight. The Biden administration very much is not trying to pick a fight. They probably regret the fight in a lot of ways. They would rather the EU be cool with this, and they're trying to smooth it over. That makes for a much less sexy kind of, and much less public debate than when you have the commander-in-chief tweeting like, screw you, cheese-eating surrender monkeys. USA, USA, USA. Um,
Right.
and the climate aspect of it on top of it as well makes it harder to pass. Like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Like
Right.
all this kind of stuff. The protectionism isn't the point here, though it kind of is.
And I think it's such an interesting point because it's that idea of like when like a lot of the stuff is just like, oh, look, a squirrel. And the reality is, I mean, the reality can be bad, but the reality often is that other things that are going unnoticed are more consequential, and that's where you should be paying attention. I think that's a very interesting point. So let's finish on you giving me where you think this goes next. Does the US stick to its guns? I mean, it's a piece of legislation, so
Yeah.
there's going to have to be changes domestically in Congress for that to change, or do you think Europe? Do they reach an accommodation, as you was talking about briefly, with like carve outs for European manufacturers in the US, or where does this go, and diplomatically, how damaging do you think it will be?
Um, I would say, if I had to guess, and I'm not sort of an EU or US politics expert by any stretch of the imagination, firstly, there's no chance this gets changed in Congress. There wasn't much chance of that before the Republicans took the House. Now they're not changing the IRA. So what's in the legislation is in the legislation. I think the Biden administration will look for ways to use implementation to soften some of the impacts on Europe. Whether they'll be able to address the massive problems is still unclear, and it wouldn't
But
necessarily
by
be easy.
implementation, you mean how they enforce the law, or do they like carve
Yeah.
out
So
directions
they've got
towards?
space on exactly how they define certain things in ways that they
Okay,
could define it in a way that EU firms may be able to get in there.
right. Okay.
It's incredibly technical. This isn't my area, but that's basically they've got some wiggle room on the margins,
Mhm.
potentially being quite cheeky with the letter of the law and doing things that maybe Congress didn't necessarily envisage to soften the blow on Europe. It won't be able to address 100% of Europe's concerns, but it'll at least be able to demonstrate that they're trying. I
Sounds like a
suspect
lot of trade lawyers are going to be in good work for a while
absolutely, and with the with the WTO appellate body dead, they need it.
then.
I suspect the EU is going to face pressure to take a WTO dispute on this. That
Okay.
can't go all the way through because the appellate body is missing. The US has already killed the WTO's Court of Appeal. So the worst that can happen from the US perspective is that a panel rules against them and then they appeal it into what's called the void. So the case
And
just
it
kind
goes
of
nowhere.
sits in limbo, but it would still be a bad look. And it will be a chance to sort of air the grievances in court. And I do think the EU is going to face pressures to introduce measures of its own. Um,
Interesting.
I don't think it is going to be crippling to the relationship right now, especially because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. There is a strong sense that the West needs to stand shoulder to shoulder, and even on issues like this, they generally try to find ways to say, "But look how we're cooperating on Ukraine. We're still really good friends. We've just annoyed us on this issue, and let's let the trade stuff be the trade stuff." So that is my best guess of where we're headed.
Okay, I lied. One more. Do you think they're linked in that sense? Do you think that the US like is um, emboldened to push this kind of stuff through because they're providing such support to the EU to Ukraine, bearing that load that they're kind of like, hey, you're not going to pay us back in money or in defense, but like let us get this through.
Honestly, no. I mean, maybe it's affected a little bit of their thinking, and it certainly reminded the Europeans how much they need the US. You get news like, Germany has enough ammunition for like 1 day of combat.
Right,
That really hits home how important the US is to NATO, and I'm sure that sort of helped wake a few people up in Europe from some complacency
right.
that may have existed before. But I think fundamentally, the IRA is a domestically focused President Biden who believes in fighting climate change and rebuilding US manufacturing, passing a signature piece of domestic legislation aimed at doing just that. And I think sort of there's lots of other things going on, but for me, it boils down to that and to
Stems
that
from that.
managing the fallout.
Fascinating. I mean, I could talk to you about that. I really could for a while. That's fascinating, and I think it was a very, very succinct explanation, understanding of what that's all about. So, thank you very much for that.
Amazing. Well, we are over time. Thank you very much,
We
John,
are.
for
Apologies.
for humoring my my tradiness, and my going down the trade rabbit hole. As always, I very much encourage you to check out International Intrigue's newsletter, which you can sign up to in the comments. We will also be linking some of the sources and the media pieces we read in preparation for this piece. A big personal thank you to Sam Lowe, who took the time out of his day to send me things and explain things to me like I was 12, which always helps. Next time I'll ask him to do it like I'm 10, because I still didn't get everything he said. And what we'll be doing with this clip is, before the end of the week, we will put in those timestamps if you want to skip around just to the areas that you're interested in. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.